The story of Natalie Wood begins not on the glittering streets of Hollywood, but in a faraway land marked by fear, hunger, and escape. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco, the daughter of Russian immigrants who carried with them both hope and the weight of an old world haunted by war and revolution. Her parents had fled the Soviet Union, leaving behind relatives, language, and roots, trading it all for the dream of a safer life. But dreams are rarely clean. They arrived in America poor, frightened, and determined that their children would become something more than what history had offered them. From the beginning, Natalie's mother, Maria, saw something in her little girl. She believed the child carried destiny in her dark eyes, as if fate had marked her for greatness. That belief hardened into obsession. Maria dragged her daughters to auditions, photographs, and movie sets, pushing them into the world of lights and cameras. When Natalie was just 4 years old, she was given her first small role, a fleeting moment on screen, but enough for Maria to see the glimmer of possibility. Hollywood had noticed her child. Hollywood might save them. The little girl became a product, carefully dressed, trained, and molded. Natalie's smile was rehearsed, her manner sculpted, her charm sharpened into something marketable. She learned quickly that approval came not from who she was, but from how convincingly she could pretend. And so, Natalie Wood, the child star, was born, a mask placed gently but firmly over the fragile face of Natalia Zakharenko. Her breakthrough came at the age of 8, in the Christmas classic Miracle on 34th Street. As Susan Walker, the skeptical little girl who learns to believe in Santa Claus, Natalie captivated audiences with her poise and natural presence. Critics call her performance remarkable for a child. Directors praised her ability to take direction instantly. To the world, she was a prodigy. To her mother, she was proof that Maria's sacrifices had meaning. But to Natalie herself, she was something else entirely. A child learning that her worth existed only when others applauded. Hollywood adored her, but Hollywood also devoured her. The studios demanded endless publicity photos, interviews, and appearances. Reporters wrote of her charm, her wit, her precocious nature. Few noticed the quiet fear beneath it all. Natalie, even as a child, was terrified of displeasing anyone. She had been raised to obey, to charm, to perform. When the cameras stopped rolling, she often sat quietly, staring into mirrors as if searching for the little girl she no longer recognized. Her childhood was built on contradictions. She was famous but lonely, admired but fragile, protected yet exploited. Her mother controlled every aspect of her life, warning her that failure would destroy their family. When Natalie expressed fear or doubt, Maria reminded her that she had been born for this, that destiny demanded sacrifice. The weight of those words settled deep into Natalie's bones, shaping her into someone who lived not for herself, but for the roles demanded of her by her teenage years. Natalie was no longer just a child star. She was a young woman caught in the brutal machinery of the studio system. Warner Brothers signed her, placing her under contract, molding her image as carefully as they had done with Judy Garland and countless others before her. Every smile, every dress, every photograph was approved by publicists. Her friendships were arranged, her romances curated. She was never truly alone, yet she felt unbearably isolated. Her big break into adulthood came with Rebel Without a Cause in 1955. Cast opposite James Dean and Sal Mineo, Natalie delivered a performance that transformed her from a child actress into a serious star. Her portrayal of Judy, the troubled teenager searching for love and identity, struck a chord with audiences. But for Natalie, the role felt dangerously close to her own truth. Like Judy, she longed for acceptance, for freedom, for someone to truly see her. On screen, she found chemistry with James Dean that transcended mere acting. Off-screen, she felt a kinship with two restless souls trapped in roles too large for them to carry. The film made her a star, but it also introduced her to tragedy. James Dean's death in September 1955 shook her deeply. She had only just begun to taste adulthood, only just begun to understand friendship and rebellion, when death took one of the few people who seemed to understand her. Hollywood whispered about the curse of rebel without a cause, named dead in a crash. Sal Mineo murdered years later, Natalie herself destined for her own shadowed end. At the time, it was superstition. Later, it would become a chilling prophecy. Through the 1960s, Natalie blossomed into one of Hollywood's brightest stars. She carried herself with elegance, moving seamlessly from dramatic roles to romantic comedies. Films like Splendor in the Grass and West Side Story cemented her place among the greats. Yet behind the success, the cracks deepened. Natalie struggled with depression, with fear, with the endless battle between who she was and who she was expected to be. The studios praised her beauty, her glamour, her ability to transform, but Natalie knew that each transformation pulled her further away from herself than it was during. This time, she fell into the orbit of Robert Wagner. Handsome, charming, and equally ambitious, Wagner was Hollywood royalty in the making. Their romance was quick, passionate, and troubled. They married in 1957, becoming one of Hollywood's golden couples. To the public, they were perfect. To Natalie, the marriage was both intoxicating and suffocating. Wagner was loving but jealous, protective but controlling. Their fights were legendary, their reconciliations tender. They divorced in 1962, only to reunite and remarry a decade later. Theirs was a love story written in fire, burning bright, burning painful, impossible to extinguish. Even as her career soared, Natalie's personal life was marked by insecurity. She feared water, a phobia instilled in her as a child when a fortune teller once told Maria that Natalie would die in dark water. The words haunted her, especially as her fame carried her into the world of yachts, parties, and oceanfront glamour. Friends noted that she would often avoid swimming, clinging to the edges of pools, her eyes clouded with unease whenever the sea stretched out before her. This fear, this prophecy, hung like a shadow over her glittering life. No matter how high she climbed, no matter how brightly she shone, there was always the whisper of the water-waiting dot. And so in Natalie Wood's early years, the child star molded by her mother, the young actress transformed by Hollywood, the restless woman bound by love and fear carried her inevitably toward the night when her destiny would collide with the ocean. But before that night came, there were more triumphs, more heartbreaks, and more shadows yet to fall. The girl who once learned to pretend had become a woman trapped between truth and illusion. And Hollywood, as always, was waiting to see what role she would play next. The 60s carved Natalie Wood into a symbol of elegance and vulnerability. She was no longer the child prodigy or the rebellious teen from Rebel Without a Cause. She had blossomed into a woman whose face alone could sell magazines, whose name drew crowds to theaters, and whose personal life became tabloid obsession. Yet, Natalie herself often felt like she was drifting through a life scripted by others. A life where she played the starlet but longed to be something real, something raw. In 1961, Natalie took on the role of Maria in West Side Story, a film that became a cultural phenomenon. The story of doomed lovers caught in the crossfire of hatred and division mirrored Natalie's own sense of being caught between worlds. Though her singing was dubbed, her performance radiated authenticity. Millions were captivated, yet Natalie herself felt strangely hollow. She worried constantly about whether she was truly talented, or whether she was only surviving because of her looks, her reputation, and her mother's relentless shaping. Beneath the adoration, insecurity gnawed at her soul. Her personal life reflected the turbulence of her inner world. After her divorce from Robert Wagner, she sought love and stability elsewhere. For a time, she was romantically linked to Warren Beatty, the young actor with ambition as fierce as fire. Their relationship was passionate, volatile, and ultimately unsustainable. Beatty was consumed by his career, unwilling to provide Natalie with the tenderness she craved. The press thrived on their every argument, every reconciliation, every whispered rumor. To the world, Natalie was a glamorous woman moving from one high-profile romance to another. To herself, she was a lonely heart searching desperately for safety in a city built on illusions. The mid-60s brought Natalie to splendor in the grass, perhaps her most emotionally devastating role. Playing Deanie, a young woman driven to madness by heartbreak, Natalie poured her soul into the performance. Critics hailed it as one of the greatest performances of her career. Yet behind the acclaim, there was truth. Natalie had lived the loneliness, the fragility, the crushing weight of expectations. She had tasted the edges of despair herself, and on set, she often found the lines between character and self dangerously thin. Some who worked with her whispered that Natalie wasn't acting. She was bleeding onto the screen. By her late 20s, the pressures of Hollywood began to break her spirit. She entered therapy, a rare admission in an era when such things were kept secret. The therapist's notes, later revealed, painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by fear, shame, and an unshakable sense of inadequacy. She suffered from insomnia, often lying awake at night, haunted by memories of her childhood, by her mother's controlling voice, by the prophecy of water that seemed to echo in her dreams. She confided in friends that she often felt she was sleepwalking through her own life, unable to find a path back to herself. Despite her inner turmoil, Natalie continued to shine outwardly. She attended parties with Frank Sinatra, dined with the Rat Pack, danced through glittering Hollywood nights. Photographers captured her in diamonds and gowns, her smile radiant, her laughter melodic. Few could see that behind those sparkling eyes was a soul weighed down by shadows. Her life was a performance, and she had mastered the art of hiding her true emotions in plain sight. As the 70s approached, Natalie found herself drawn once again to Robert Wagner. Their years apart had not dulled the fire between them. If anything, time had deepened the bond. Wagner had matured, weathered his own storms, and Natalie saw in him not only the man she once loved, but the safety she still craved. They remarried in 1972, rekindling their volatile romance. Friends called them destined lovers, two halves of the same flame. Others warned that old wounds cannot be healed by nostalgia. For Natalie, the remarriage was both a new beginning and a return to familiar patterns of jealousy, passion, and doubt. This second marriage coincided with her gradual withdrawal from the Hollywood spotlight. She was no longer the girl who had to prove herself at every turn. She had fame, fortune, and family. With Wagner, she raised her daughters, Natasha, and later Courtney, devoting herself to motherhood in a way she had once never thought possible. Her home life became her sanctuary, though the shadows never fully left. She was fiercely protective of her children, determined to shield them from the same pressures that had devoured her own childhood. Yet even in her happiest moments, the fear lingered. The water, the prophecy, the idea that fate was waiting patiently for her daughter as she aged into her 30s and early 40s. Natalie also confronted Hollywood's cruel reality. The roles for women dwindled. The studio system that once adored her began to shift toward younger faces, fresher talents. The men she once starred opposite continued to receive leading roles, while Natalie was offered supporting parts or characters defined only by their relationships to men. She fought to remain relevant, but the industry that had built her was ready to replace her. The rejection deepened her insecurities, reminding her once again that her value was conditional. her worth measured only in ticket sales and studio profits. In this period of career uncertainty, Natalie turned increasingly to television, taking roles in miniseries and TV films. Though the pay was respectable and the work steady, she felt the sting of stepping away from the big screen. For someone who had been raised to equate success with stardom, the adjustment was painful. Yet she carried herself with grace, never allowing the public to see her doubt. Outwardly, she was still Natalie Wood, glamorous, elegant, admired. Inwardly, she wrestled with the fading of a light she had worked her entire life to maintain. But fate has a way of circling back, of pulling old fears into the present. Natalie's phobia of water had never faded, and as her life with Wagner stabilized, the ocean became a more frequent backdrop. The couple bought a yacht, the Splendor, where they entertained friends, sailed to Catalina, and indulged in the lifestyle expected of Hollywood royalty. To others, it seemed idyllic. To Natalie, it was a quiet torment. She loved the freedom of the sea air, the beauty of sunsets over the waves, yet she was constantly uneasy. Friends noticed that she would rarely climb into dinghies alone, that she clung tightly to railings, that she seemed perpetually alert, as if the ocean were watching her in return. She once confided in a close friend, "I'm terrified of dark water. I don't know why. It feels like something is waiting for me there." The statement was brushed off as melodrama, the kind of remark a sensitive actress might make. But those who knew her well understood that Natalie's fear was no performance. It was a part of her, as real and as relentless as her heartbeat. And as the years wore on, the whispers of fate grew louder. Her career was quieting, her marriage once again showed cracks, and her phobia lingered like a shadow at the edge of every beautiful horizon. Natalie Wood had risen from immigrant roots to global stardom. She had been a child prodigy, a Hollywood icon, a mother, a wife, a survivor. Yet the story was not finished. The stage was being set for one final act, one that would forever blur the line between tragedy and mystery. And so we arrive at the edge of the 1980s. Natalie Wood, still radiant, still admired, was preparing to take on new roles, to rediscover her place in an industry that had both created and consumed her. She seemed poised for a quiet renaissance. But the whispers of water, the prophecy of her youth, and the shadows of jealousy that followed her everywhere were closing in. Her destiny was waiting, and it would find her in the place she feared most. By 1980, Natalie Wood had lived a life most would call extraordinary. She had survived the ruthless machinery of Hollywood, endured the pressures of child stardom, navigated fame, heartbreak, and love. She had faced the insecurities that came with fading youth in an industry that worshipped fresh faces. Yet, for all she had endured, the public saw only glamour. To her fans, she remained untouchable, a star with flawless beauty and eternal grace. But behind that beauty was a woman carrying secrets, scars, and a fear that would soon overtake everything else. The second marriage to Robert Wagner was both comforting and suffocating. On the surface, they seemed happy, a Hollywood power couple, gracing red carpets, vacationing in Europe, and hosting dinners aboard their yacht, the Splendor. Yet beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Wagner was charming, but his jealousy had not disappeared with time. Natalie, now more independent, sometimes found herself caught between her husband's possessiveness and her own desire for freedom. Their arguments could be heated, their reconciliations tender, their love undeniable but volatile. It was a bond as consuming as it was destructive. Professionally, Natalie was searching for a second act. She had begun taking on television projects, but she longed for a return to the silver screen. Offers trickled in, some promising, others mediocre. She wanted roles that would challenge her, roles that would remind audiences why she had been a star. Yet Hollywood was changing. The era of the studio system had long passed, and younger actresses were rising, eager to take the spotlight. Natalie, still radiant, still talented, found herself battling invisibility. The industry that had once embraced her was now looking elsewhere. In 1981, she accepted a role in Brainstorm, a science fiction film directed by Douglas Trumbull, opposite Christopher Walken. Walken was a younger, enigmatic, and intensely private man who carried with him an aura of mystery. Natalie was intrigued. On set, the two formed a bond, not romantic in any obvious sense, but close enough to draw Wagner's suspicion. To Wagner, every glance, every laugh, every conversation between Natalie and Walken seemed loaded. His jealousy was surfaced, raw and uncontainable. Friends noticed the tension. Natalie seemed caught in the middle, loyal to her husband, but also drawn to the intellectual companionship she found in Walken. The cracks in her marriage widened. Arguments spilled over into public, whispered about in the gossip columns. Natalie confided in friends that Wagner's jealousy was suffocating her. Wagner, in turn, believed he was fighting to protect the woman he loved. The cycle was endless. Love, jealousy, fights, reconciliation. It was as if they were bound together by both devotion and destruction. As autumn of 1981 arrived, Natalie decided to take a break on a trip aboard the Splendor to Catalina Island. The plan was simple: a weekend getaway with Wagner, Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. It was meant to be a relaxing escape, a chance to clear the air, to rest. But to those who later pieced together the events of that weekend, the yacht trip became something else entirely. The stage for one of Hollywood's greatest mysteries. The Splendor was a luxurious vessel, gleaming white, furnished for comfort, and built for indulgence. Natalie adored its beauty, but never felt fully at ease aboard it. The ocean stretched endlessly around her, a reminder of her deepest fear. Still, she smiled, entertained, and played her part as hostess. On board, however, tension simmered. Wagner and Walken clashed, their conversations escalating into arguments about Natalie, about her career, about life itself. Alcohol flowed freely, fueling tempers and loosening tongues. Captain Davern later described the atmosphere as charged, as though an invisible storm was brewing just beneath the laughter and clinking glasses. That Saturday night, November 28, 1981, was when the storm broke. Accounts differ. Some say Wagner and Walken argued fiercely about Natalie's career, Wagner accusing Walken of encouraging her independence, Walken defending her right to pursue roles. Others say the argument was more personal, a clash of egos inflamed by jealousy. Whatever the truth, the fight was loud enough that Davern remembered it clearly decades later. Natalie, upset, retreated to her cabin. What happened next remains cloaked in shadows, shifting depending on whose story is told. What is known is this: sometime during that night, Natalie disappeared. Her body was later found floating in the cold waters near the yacht, dressed in a nightgown, socks, and a down jacket. She was only 43 years old. The official cause of death: accidental drowning. The coroner's report suggested she had attempted to climb into the yacht's dinghy, slipped, and drowned. But the details, the bruises on her body, the timeline of events, the conflicting testimonies left behind more questions than answers. Hollywood was stunned. Fans mourned the loss of a beloved star, taken too soon. But whispers began almost immediately. Why would Natalie, terrified of water, attempt to leave the yacht in the middle of the night? Why were there bruises on her arms and legs? Why did Wagner wait hours before calling for help? Why did Davern later change his story, claiming Wagner had been involved in an argument with Natalie before she vanished? The mystery deepened with every retelling. Some believed Wagner knew more than he admitted. Others suspected foul play, perhaps an accident turned tragic, perhaps something darker. Walken, enigmatic as ever, remained silent, giving only vague interviews. insisting he knew nothing beyond the official story. The truth seemed to sink with Natalie that night, swallowed by the waters she had always feared. Her funeral was a Hollywood spectacle, attended by stars, directors, and producers who had once shaped her life. Elizabeth Taylor wept openly. Frank Sinatra sent flowers. Robert Redford stood in silence. Wagner, devastated, played the role of grieving widower, though suspicion followed him like a shadow. The world said goodbye to Natalie Wood, but it did not say goodbye to the questions. For decades, her death remained classified as an accident. Yet the whispers never faded. Journalists, biographers, and fans continued to dig, piecing together fragments, trying to make sense of a night that made no sense at all. The image of Natalie Wood, beautiful, frightened, lost in dark water, haunted Hollywood. She had lived a life defined by roles, by illusions, by stories written for her. In death, she became the central figure in a story no one could finish. And as the years stretched on, the case refused to rest. The death of Natalie Wood might have been filed away as a tragic accident, had it not been for the unease that lingered around every detail. From the very first newspaper headlines, something about the story did not add up. The world had lost a Hollywood legend, but it had also inherited a mystery, one wrapped in silence, contradiction, and dark water. The official version that Natalie had attempted to secure the yacht's dinghy, slipped and drowned, seemed implausible to those who knew her. She was terrified of water, unwilling to swim unless in shallow pools, unwilling even to take a bath without anxiety creeping into her chest. The thought of her venturing alone into the night, into a dinghy, in the cold November darkness, was almost unthinkable. Yet that was the explanation her death certificate carried. Accident. In the weeks following her death, speculation buzzed through Hollywood. The tabloids churned with rumor, printing bold headlines that asked questions the authorities seemed unwilling to pursue. Was there a fight aboard the Splendor? Did jealousy turn deadly? Why were there delays in calling the Coast Guard? For every official answer, 10 new questions surfaced. Robert Wagner became both a grieving husband and a silent suspect. His image was carefully managed, the devastated widower clutching his daughters, his face pale at the funeral, his voice trembling in interviews. Yet whispers grew louder behind closed doors. Friends recalled his jealous outbursts, his controlling nature. Some even whispered of arguments they had witnessed between Wagner and Natalie in the years before. Hollywood had always loved the scandal, and this one was irresistible. A golden couple shattered by tragedy, with the possibility of secrets lurking just beneath the surface. Christopher Walken, by contrast, withdrew entirely. The enigmatic actor, known for his intensity on screen, now seemed ghost-like in public. He attended the funeral, but avoided questions, giving little more than curt, vague responses when pressed. His silence fueled theories. Was he hiding something? Had he seen more than he admitted? Or was he simply traumatized by a night he wished to forget? The captain of the Splendor, Dennis Davern, initially supported Wagner's version of events. But as the years passed, his story began to shift. He gave interviews, wrote a book, confessed to details he claimed had been left out in the original investigation. According to Davern, there had been a fierce argument between Wagner and Natalie that night, words exchanged in anger. Jealousy inflamed by suspicion of her closeness to Walken. Davern suggested Wagner had pushed or struck Natalie, that he had delayed calling for help, that the truth had been buried beneath grief and influence. In 2011, 30 years after Natalie's death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case, citing new witness statements and Davern's evolving testimony. The decision shocked the public, reigniting fascination with the mystery. Suddenly, a story that had been gathering dust was thrust back into the spotlight. Forensic experts reviewed the autopsy report. Some noted the bruises on Natalie's arms and legs, injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. Others pointed to scratches that suggested she may have struggled in the water. The death certificate was amended in 2012, where it had once read accidental drowning. It was changed to drowning in other undetermined factors. The wording was clinical, but the implication was chilling. Natalie's death could no longer be dismissed as a simple accident. Something else had happened that night, though what? No one could say with certainty. Wagner, by then in his 80s, remained steadfast in his denial of wrongdoing. He refused to discuss the details publicly, calling Natalie's death a nightmare he lived with every day. To some, his silence was evidence of guilt. To others, it was the natural response of a man hounded by decades of suspicion. Walken, too, remained elusive, offering only cryptic fragments of memory when pressed. She went to bed, he once said. They were arguing, and then she was gone. His words only deepened the enigma. For Natalie's daughters, Natasha and Courtney, the reopening of the case was agonizing. They defended their father, insisting he was not capable of harming Natalie, pleading for the world to let her rest in peace. Yet even their loyalty could not silence the questions. Biographers, journalists, and true crime investigators continued to probe, combing through archives, interviewing anyone connected to that night, searching for the elusive truth. Theories multiplied. Some believed Wagner and Natalie fought, that she tried to escape in the dinghy, and an accident followed a heated moment. Others whispered darker possibilities, that Wagner had deliberately pushed her, that alcohol and anger had turned fatal. A few even speculated about Walken's involvement, though no evidence ever supported the claim. The ocean held its secrets, and those who might have known more carried them into silence. In 2018, Robert Wagner was officially named a person of interest in the case. It was not an indictment, not a charge, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the media. Wagner, once celebrated as a Hollywood legend, now carried a shadow he could never escape. His career, long since slowed by age, became defined not by his roles, but by the questions surrounding his wife's death. Through it all, Natalie Wood remained frozen in time, the beautiful starlet with dark eyes and a haunting smile. Forever young, forever tragic. She became an icon not only of Hollywood glamour, but of Hollywood mystery. Her films continued to inspire, her story continued to ache in the hearts of fans, and her death continued to haunt. The case today remains officially open, unresolved, unsettled. Every new documentary, every new article, every whispered memory adds another layer, but the truth remains submerged. The night of November 28, 1981, refuses to give up its secrets, and so the legend of Natalie Wood endures not just as a star, not just as a victim, but as a mystery that Hollywood cannot bury. She once said, "The only time a woman really succeeds in changing a man is when he is a baby." But perhaps she herself knew that the only real change was something beyond anyone's control. Fate. The water had always waited for her, and when it finally claimed her, it left behind ripples that continued to disturb the surface of Hollywood decades later. The tabloids feasted. They printed rumors of affairs, jealous rages, Hollywood conspiracies. They hinted that Walken and Natalie had been closer than they let on, that Wagner's temper had snapped, that Davern had seen more than he admitted. They spoke of bruises, of silence, of timelines that didn't match. The stories twisted and tangled until truth and fiction became inseparable. And yet, for the average reader, the official word was the last word. Natalie Wood had drowned. Case closed. Hollywood moved on, as Hollywood always does. Films were made, stars rose and fell, and Natalie became another face on the wall of tragic legends. But the sea never forgets, and neither did those who had been there that night. For decades, the story lay dormant, buried beneath Wagner's career revival and Walken's silence. But every so often, A detail resurfaced, a memory shifted, and the shadows stirred once more. The captain began to talk. Journalists began to dig. Detectives began to wonder. And slowly, the cracks in the story grew wider, because some believed Natalie Wood had not simply drowned. Some believed she had been silenced. Her voice lost not to the waves, but to the secrets of those who had stood with her on the SPL, ENDOUR. And in 2011, 30 years after her death, the case would be reopened. Natalie's body, her story, her mystery, none of it would rest. The sea had claimed her, but the truth had not yet been buried. The waves had long since calmed. The lights of Hollywood had moved on to new scandals, and Natalie Wood's name became something whispered with reverence, sadness, and confusion. For decades after her drowning in 1981, the official story remained untouched. It was an accident, a tragic slip. The ocean had claimed her, and no one was to blame. Robert Wagner mourned her publicly, raising their daughters. Christopher Walken buried himself in his work, speaking almost nothing of that night. Captain Dennis Davern stayed close to Wagner, his story neat and rehearsed. But time has a way of gnawing its silence. Memories rot and shift. Guilt seeps into cracks, and the neat edges of the official version began to fray. The first whispers came from Davern. In interviews years after the tragedy, his tone changed. He admitted that he had lied during the original investigation. Lied to protect Wagner. Lied because he had been told to. He began to suggest that the argument between Wagner and Natalie was far worse than he had originally claimed. That the sound of shouting on the deck was not just another marital spat, but something darker. He said Wagner's jealousy of Walken had boiled over, and that Natalie's final moments alive had been filled with fear and rage. The captain's conscience was heavy. For years, he drank to silence it. For years, he clung to the official line. But guilt is relentless. By the early 2000s, he began to speak more openly. He told writers and interviewers that Wagner had fought with Natalie, that the truth had been covered up. He stopped short of directly accusing Wagner of murder, but the suggestion was clear. Natalie Wood had not simply slipped away into the night. Then, in 2011, 30 years after the drowning, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case. The reason? New information. The official ruling of accidental drowning was suddenly no longer enough. Detectives wanted to hear from Davern again. They wanted to examine inconsistencies in testimony. They wanted to look at the autopsy with fresh eyes. The coroner revisited Natalie's body, or rather, the evidence recorded from it. And this time, something stood out. The bruises. They had been dismissed in 1981 as injuries sustained in the water, the result of flailing and striking against the dinghy or the rocks. But now, with fresh scrutiny, the bruises looked less like random marks of an accident and more like defensive wounds. They were on her arms, her legs, even her face. The new conclusion: the bruising could have occurred prior to entering the water. The cause of death was amended. No longer simply accidental drowning. Now it read, drowning and other undetermined factors. The wording was subtle. But in that subtlety was an earthquake. Robert Wagner, for years, the grieving widower, suddenly found himself under the shadow of suspicion. In 2018, the Sheriff's Department went further. They officially named him a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death. Not a suspect, not charged, but no longer untouchable. They said his account did not match the evidence, that his story had shifted over the years, but with shadows. Not with certainty, but with the lingering chill of what might have been done. And so her life closes like the final scene of a film. The camera pulling back, the music swelling, the audience leaning forward, waiting for a revelation that never comes. Only silence. Only the endless sea dot in the end. Natalie Wood remains suspended between truth and legend, between accident and crime, between love and betrayal. The waves carried her away, but the questions remained forever echoing across the dark waters of Catalina Island. And perhaps that is where her story was always meant to end. Not with clarity, but with mystery. Not with certainty, but with the eternal whisper of the sea. Hollywood lost a star, but gained a mystery it will never solve. Natalie Wood lives on, not just in her films, but in the haunting silence of that night. Was it fate? Was it jealousy? Or was it something we will never know? The sea keeps its secrets, and Natalie Wood became one of them.